The scratch at the door was soft, almost polite. That was the strange part, Raid Solly's thought later, not the fact that something was out there at 3 in the morning. Strange things found Sable Ridge from time to time. The wind alone could make a man think he had visitors. But this scratch was careful, patient, like whatever was making it understood that it had to be heard without frightening the thing inside. Raid was a light sleeper, had been since Dora died. He lay still for a few seconds, listening, and when the scratch came again, he rolled out of bed without hurrying, pulled on his boots, picked up the long iron wrench he kept against the wall near the door, and stood there for a moment. Then he opened it. The cold came in first, then the smell, iron and something burnt, and something else he did not have a name for, and then he saw them. 3 creatures on his porch, small in the way that a large dog is small, scaled, dark-colored, their wings folded tight against their bodies. Their eyes were open. They were all looking at him. He knew what they were. Everyone on the fringe colonies knew what Drakari looked like. You learned young, the same way you learned which plants were poison and which clouds meant trouble. The Drakari were the ones who owned the sky, who owned most things, really, or believed they did. Their ships were always somewhere overhead, big and slow and certain of themselves, the way things are certain when nothing has ever threatened them. These 3 were not certain of anything. One of them had a wing bent at the wrong angle. All of them were shaking. Raid looked at them for a long moment. He looked at the dark behind them, at the flat empty land of his farm, at the sky where there were no ships and no lights. He looked back at the 3 small creatures on his porch. He stepped aside. "Get inside before the cold kills you," he said. They did not move immediately. The largest one, the one whose eyes were steadiest, stared at him with an expression that might have been suspicion or might have been disbelief. Then it moved. The others followed. They came through the door low and careful, wings brushing the frame, claws quiet on the wooden floor. Raid shut the door behind them. He lit the lamp on the table. In the yellow light they looked worse. The small one, the one with the bent wing, had a dark stain down its side that was not shadow. The middle one was trembling hard enough that Raid could hear the faint rattle of its scales. He went to the back room and came back with a blanket, his kit box, and the last of the dried meat from the shelf. He put the meat on the floor in front of them without ceremony and opened the kit box. The largest one made a sound. The translator bead in Raid's ear, old and cheap, and bought second-hand at the colony market, picked it up and turned it into words. "You will send a signal to the Empire. Tell them where we are. You will be rewarded." Raid looked up from the kit box. "I'll get to that," he said. "Let me see the wing first." "You will do as told. This is not." "I heard you." He looked at the small one. "Come here." The small one looked at the large one. Then it came forward. Raid worked slowly and carefully, the way he worked at everything. The wing was not broken, just badly wrenched at the joint. He cleaned the cut on the small one's side. It flinched once, but did not pull away. He wrapped the joint with a strip of cloth and tied it firm but not tight. The whole time the largest one watched him with those flat, still eyes. When he was done, he sat back and looked at the 3 of them. "There's water in the bucket by the window," he said. "Sleep where you like, floor's clean enough." He stood up, put the kit box away, and went back to his room. The lamp stayed lit in the main room. Raid lay on his bed and listened. There was some movement, a low sound he could not make out, then quiet. He slept. In the morning he woke before light, the way he always did, and found all 3 of them still there. The smallest one was curled near the stove, asleep. The middle one was sitting up, watching the window, watching the dark outside slowly turn to gray. The largest one was in the corner, eyes open, staring at Raid the moment he appeared in the doorway. "You did not send a signal," it said. "No," Raid agreed. He went to the stove and started the fire. "Why?" He thought about it, put the kettle on. "Because I was sleeping," he said. There was a silence behind him that he could feel more than hear. It had a quality to it that he recognized. It was the silence of something that expected a different kind of answer and did not know what to do with the one it got. He made his food. He put more dried meat on the floor for them. He ate standing at the counter, looking out at his field in the early light. The middle one moved. It came and stood a little way from him and looked out the same window. After a while, it spoke. The translator gave him words in a flat, neutral tone. "This land is poor." "Yes," Raid said. "You farm it alone." "Yes." "Why?" Raid drank from his cup. "Because it's mine," he said, "and because nothing else is going to do it for me." The middle one was quiet. It looked at the field for a long time. The smallest one woke up and immediately tried to stand on the wrapped wing and immediately sat back down. It looked at its own wing with an expression of personal offense. Then it looked at Raid. "It does not hurt as much," it said. The translator caught it as a statement, flat and plain, but there was something in the tone beneath that Raid thought might have been the closest thing a Drakari hatchling could manage to gratitude. "Good," he said. "Don't walk on it for a few days." The largest one spoke from the corner. "You will send the signal today." "Maybe," Raid said. He put his cup down and picked up his boots. "After the east field." He went out. The door swung shut behind him. Inside, the largest hatchling stared at the door. The middle one turned from the window. "It is not afraid of us," it said. "It is stupid," the largest one said. "No," the middle one looked back at the grey field outside, at the thin figure already moving through it, slow and steady and unbothered. "I do not think that is what it is." The smallest one curled closer to the stove. Outside, Raid Solis walked his rows in the cold morning and thought about nothing except the soil and the work, and how many more weeks before the first crop would be ready. The same things he thought about every morning. 3 Drakari hatchlings in his house was a problem for later. The field was a problem for right now. Right now always came first. 23 days went by. Not in a rush. Days on Sable Ridge never rushed. They came in slow and grey and went out the same way, and in between them, a man had to find enough to do to make them worth the trouble. Raid found enough. He always had. The signal never got sent. It was not that he decided against it. It was more that every morning he woke up with a list of things the day needed from him, and the signal was never near the top of the list. The east field needed turning. The water pump at the south end had started making a noise it was not supposed to make. One of the roof panels had warped in the last cold snap and needed to come down and be reset before the next rain found the gap. The 3 hatchlings were still there. This had surprised them more than it surprised Raid. The largest one, who had taken to watching Raid from the doorway every morning with its arms crossed and its eyes very still, had asked on the 4th day when the signal would be sent. Raid had said soon. On the 8th day it asked again. Raid said after the pump. On the 12th day it did not ask, it just watched. Something had happened on the 11th day that Raid thought might have been responsible for that. He had been working on the pump since early morning. It was a bad job. The casing had corroded at the joint and the whole lower section had to come off, which meant lying in the mud under the housing with a torch in his teeth and both hands doing work his hands were not really shaped for anymore. He had been at it for 4 hours when he heard something behind him. He looked back. The largest hatchling was standing there, watching him. "You are doing it wrong," it said. Raid pulled himself partway out of the mud. "Is that right?" "The pressure coupling. It must come off before the lower casing or the seal will crack." Raid looked at it for a moment. "You know water pumps." "I know pressurized systems. The principle is the same." He considered this, then he moved aside. The largest hatchling lay down in the mud without hesitation. Its hands, clawed, four-fingered. Stronger than Raid's by a distance he did not want to estimate, went into the housing. It worked quickly. It did not speak. When it came out 10 minutes later, the job was done in a way that would have taken Raid another 2 hours. It stood up, mud on its scales. It looked at the pump, then at Raid. "It will hold," it said. "Thank you," Raid said. The largest hatchling walked back to the house without another word. But it did not ask about the signal again for a long time after that, and when it finally did, something in the question was different, less like a command, more like something it felt it was supposed to say. The middle one had started following Raid on his rounds about a week in, not helping, just watching. Raid did not mind. He was used to working without talking. The middle one seemed to understand this quickly, which he appreciated. It watched the way he tested soil between his fingers to judge moisture, the way he looked at the sky for a long time before deciding whether to water or wait, the way he repaired a fence post not by replacing it, but by splitting a piece of old board and bracing it on either side, which was slower than replacing it, but cost nothing. On the 15th day it spoke. "Your tools are old." "Yes," Raid said. "Better tools would make the work faster." "They would." "Then why not get better tools?" Raid straightened up and looked at the fence line. "Because these ones still work," he said, "and because what I'd spend on new tools, I need for seed." The middle one was quiet. "Then, you make choices based on what you have, not what you want." "Most people do," Raid said. "Out here anyway." The middle one thought about this for the rest of the day. Raid could almost hear it thinking. It had that quality that some creatures had, a weight to its silence, like there was more going on inside than the outside showed. The smallest one was easier. It had stopped being careful around Raid sometime around day 3 and had moved straight into asking questions, which it did constantly and without any apparent concern for whether the questions were important or not. How did seeds know to grow up and not down? Why did the clouds on Sable Ridge move faster in the evening than the morning? What did Raid do in the house at night when it was dark? Did all humans live alone or just this one? Raid answered everything. He was not a man who talked much, but he could answer a straight question with a straight answer, and the smallest one always asked straight questions even when they were about strange things. On the 19th day, it asked about Dora. There was a photograph on the wall inside, old and slightly faded, a woman with short hair and a sharp kind of smile. The smallest one had looked at it many times before asking. It said, "Who is that?" "My wife," Raid said. "Where is she?" "She died 4 years ago." The smallest one looked at the photograph for a while. "Did you want her to not be dead?" "Yes," Raid said. "What did you do?" Raid picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. "Kept going," he said. The smallest one nodded slowly, the way it did when it was filing something away. Then on the 23rd day the storm came. Raid had seen it building for 2 days. He knew the sky on Sable Ridge the way he knew the layout of his own house in the dark. He went to his neighbors, the Burrow family half a kilometer east and Old Western who farmed the rocky land to the north, and told them what was coming. They came that evening, the Burrows with their 2 grown sons and Western with a cart, and they all worked together through the falling dark, getting the crop under cover and the equipment tied down and the roof panels secured. The Hatchlings watched from the doorway at first. Then the eldest went to the Burrow boys without a word and began moving supply crates that would have taken 2 men each. The middle one went to where Raid was struggling with a long sheet of cover material in the rising wind and simply took the far end and held it firm while Raid tied off his side. The smallest one, wings still wrapped, used its good wing as a shield to keep the rain off the seed bags while Old Western moved them into the storage shed one by one. Nobody asked them to, nobody thanked them in the moment. There was no time for that. There was only the work and the storm and the need to finish before the worst of it hit. They finished with about 20 minutes to spare. Everyone came inside and stood in Raid's main room dripping and catching their breath. Old Western looked at the 3 hatchlings for a moment. Then he nodded at them the way he nodded at anyone who had done their part. "Good work," he said. The largest hatchling said nothing, but it stood a little differently after that. Raid noticed, because he noticed most things about people, which was a skill you developed when you spent most of your time alone. Later, when the storm was loud against the roof, and everyone had found a place to sit or rest, the largest one came and stood beside Raid. "You knew it was coming," it said, 2 days ago. "Yes. How?" The way the clouds were stacking in the south, the way the birds were moving, the way the air smelled. The largest one thought about this. There were no instruments, no forecast system. No, Raid agreed. So you used things you already knew. That's all anyone has, Raid said. The largest one was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the storm did what storms do. Inside, a farmer and a Drakari hatchling sat with that fact between them, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. The ship came down on the flat land north of Raid's field, and it did not ask permission. It was a small vessel by Drakari standards, which meant it was still large enough to make Raid's roof vibrate when it passed overhead. It landed with the kind of precision that made clear it had done this 1,000 times and considered the ground beneath it lucky for the privilege. 3 soldiers came out first, then an officer. The officer's name was Vorak. Raid learned this from the translator bead in his ear, which picked up the rank designation and the name tag on the uniform and did its job without being asked. Vorak was tall even for a Drakari, which meant he had to tilt his head slightly to look at Raid, which he did with the expression of someone checking a low shelf for something they expected to find uninteresting. "You are the occupant of this structure," Vorak said. It was not a question. "I am," Raid said. "You have been sheltering 3 Drakari youth without authorization, without notification to the Empire, and without filing a recovery assistance report. You are aware of this." "I am," Raid said again. Vorak looked at him the way a man looks at a stone wall when he expected a door. Then he looked past Raid at the 3 hatchlings who had come to stand in the farmhouse doorway. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like recalculation. The hatchlings were healthy, bigger than they had been because it had been nearly a month, and they grew fast at this age. The smallest one's wing was out of the wrapping now and moved easily. They did not look like creatures who had been neglected or frightened or used. They looked like creatures who had been somewhere long enough to stop being tense about it. Vorak walked toward them. He stopped in front of the largest one and spoke in Drakari formal register, the kind of words Raid's bead only half caught. Questions about condition, about treatment, about whether protocols had been followed. The largest one answered. Raid watched Vorak's face during those answers and saw something there he could not name exactly, a kind of careful stillness. Then Vorak turned back to Raid. "They will be collected now. You will be processed for the assistance provision. The compensation rate for unauthorized civilian care of Drakari youth is—" "I don't need compensation," Raid said. Vorak stopped. "The rate is fixed by Imperial schedule. It is not a negotiation." "I'm not negotiating. I'm saying I don't need it. Keep it." Vorak looked at him for a long moment. The 3 soldiers behind him were very still in the way that soldiers get still when something outside the expected pattern happens and they are waiting to see how their officer handles it. "Why?" Vorak said. Raid thought about how to answer that. He looked at the hatchlings in the doorway. The smallest one was watching him. He looked back at Vorak. "They needed a place," he said. "I had one, that's all." Vorak's eyes moved across Raid's face, the way a man reads a document he finds suspicious. Then he turned away and spoke to his soldiers, and the process of preparing to leave began. Raid went inside. He had a bag already partly ready. Because he had seen the ship coming and had time to think, he finished putting it together. Dried food, a wrapped medicine patch, a small heating element that ran on a power cell, good for about 2 months if used carefully. Simple things, useful things. He brought the bag out and held it toward the smallest hatchling. The smallest one looked at it, then at Raid. "For the cold nights," Raid said, "wherever they put you." The smallest one took the bag with both hands. It held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters. Raid gave a short nod, then he stepped back. The largest one spoke, and the bead caught it. "You never asked for anything." "Nothing to ask for," Raid said. "You helped us without reason." "Had reasons," Raid said, "just not the kind you buy things with." The largest one looked at him for another moment. Then it turned and walked toward the ship. The middle one lingered. It looked at Raid the way it had looked at his fields in the early mornings, like it was studying something it wanted to remember. "I will think about you," it said. The bead caught it as a flat statement, but there was weight behind it that the bead could not translate. "Think about the pump," Raid said. "Pressure coupling first." The middle one made a sound that might have been the Drakari equivalent of a short, surprised laugh. Then it followed the others. They were boarding the ship when Vorak passed Raid on the way back from a final perimeter check. He barely glanced at the farmer. Raid said, "There is an ionic storm system building in the sector to your north. It is sitting on the upper layer right now, and it is going to roll fast when it drops. Your ship's exhaust signature will pull the ionic front toward you. If you go spinward, you can get under it before it moves." Vorak stopped. He looked at Raid, at the man's worn boots and old coat, and the wrench still leaning against the doorframe where it had been since the first night. He looked at the empty flat land of Sable Ridge and the low grey sky and the field that was small and plain and ordinary. "Thank you for the report," he said, and the way he said it made clear he meant nothing of the kind. He boarded his ship. It rose, turned north, and vanished into the cloud cover. Raid stood in his field for a while after it was gone. He looked north at the sky. The clouds up there were moving in a way he did not like, a particular kind of stacking, low and dark, and with that greenish tinge at the edges that meant ionic activity in the upper layers. He had told Vorak the truth. He always told the truth. It was simpler, and he had enough to keep track of without also keeping track of things he had invented. He went inside and got back to work. 38 hours later, a Drakari military vessel sent a distress call from 3 sectors north. It had been caught in a sudden ionic storm of unusual intensity and had taken significant damage to 3 of its 4 drive units. No lives were lost. The crew was recovered by a passing freight hauler 2 days later. The officer in charge filed his incident report. In the notes section, almost as an afterthought, he wrote that a civilian at the recovery location had offered a navigational warning prior to departure which had been assessed as low confidence and disregarded. He did not file a second report about this. He told himself it was because there was nothing more to say about it. But for a long time after, in the way that certain things stay with a person whether they want them to or not, Vorak kept thinking about a farmer standing in a flat grey field, saying plain things in a plain voice and being right. Being completely, exactly, and quietly right. Back on Sable Ridge, Raid turned the south corner of his field and kept walking. The sky was clear above him. The work was what it always was. There was nothing unusual about the day. Somewhere far above, a small bag with a heating element was on board a Drakari ship, held carefully by the smallest of 3 hatchlings, who was already trying to figure out how the power cell connected. Raid did not know that, but he would not have been surprised. 7 years is not a long time to a Drakari. Their lives stretched long, 3 centuries or more for most, and so their sense of time moved differently. A decade was like a season. A generation passed the way a month passed for a human, noticeable but not surprising. Youth was a long, slow country, and the 3 hatchlings had a great deal of it left ahead of them when the ship from Sable Ridge brought them back into the layers of Drakari civilization. They were enrolled in the correct institutes, put through the correct programs, given the correct instruction in history, in physical development, in military theory, in the deep traditions of the Drakari hierarchy that had organized 400 star systems for 3,000 years. Their instructors had high expectations, the bloodlines were good, the potential was clear. The results were strange. The first sign came during the largest one's 3rd year of military training. A unit exercise, standard design, meant to test individual decision-making under pressure. Each trainee was placed in command of a simulated unit and given an impossible logistical problem, the kind with no right answer, only a least wrong answer, the kind meant to reveal character. The expected solution was to push through with force, accept losses, achieve the objective. Every trainee before had done some version of this. The variations were in the style, the boldness, the creativity of the push. The largest one did not push. It called its simulated unit together, distributed the problem to all of them, asked what each one could do and what each one knew, and then built a solution out of what was available rather than what was desirable. The exercise finished with minimal loss and a completed objective. The instructor flagged it immediately. The approach was undrakari in a way that was difficult to explain but easy to feel. It worked too well through methods that were not supposed to work. There was a word for what the largest one had done, but it was a word usually applied to lower species. The word was cooperation, not the formal alliance type that Drakari practiced between great houses, but the instinctive, flat, roll-up-and-do-it-together kind that implied no hierarchy at all. The instructor filed a report. It landed on a desk where several other unusual reports about the same three individuals were beginning to accumulate. The middle one's papers were causing their own discomfort in academic circles. In the years since returning, it had quietly pursued a study of fringe colony species behavior, which was considered a minor field and largely treated as a hobby for scholars who were not serious enough for real work. The papers the middle one was producing were precise, deeply researched, and deeply uncomfortable. The core argument was not dramatic. It was stated plainly, in clear language, which somehow made it worse. The argument was this, that species with short lifespans and limited resources operated under evolutionary pressures that produced a particular kind of flexibility, that this flexibility looked like weakness from outside but functioned like strength under sustained pressure. That the Drakari model of civilization, which valued individual power, long-term accumulation, and hierarchical certainty, was extremely good at dominating other civilizations, but poorly designed to adapt when the ground shifted. And that the ground, the middle one wrote in its most recent paper, was always shifting. Senior scholars dismissed the work publicly. A few read it more carefully in private and did not sleep well afterward. The smallest one was causing a different kind of trouble. It had completed its formal schooling faster than expected, not because it was in a hurry, but because it had the habit, picked up somewhere, of doing what was in front of it until it was done rather than drawing the process out. It had spent the following years moving between places, fringe worlds, human settlements, small colonies at the edges of the maps that the Empire did not look at often. It learned languages quickly. It worked with its hands when work was needed. It listened far more than it spoke. It was preparing, on its return to the Drakari core worlds, to submit for the Naming trial. The Naming trial was old tradition. A young Drakari chose the name it would carry for its life, and the name had to be justified before a formal panel. The name had to mean something. It had to be earned. The smallest one stood before the panel and said the name it had chosen. Solis. The panel was quiet for a long moment. One of them said, carefully, that Solis was a human name, a surname, specifically, from a human colony in the fringe. Was the applicant certain this was the intended choice? The smallest one said yes. It explained its reasoning. The name belonged to a man who had done something the smallest one did not have a Drakari word for, not kindness exactly, because kindness implied effort, something given against an instinct to hold back. This was something simpler. A man had seen three things that needed help. He had helped them. He had not calculated the benefit. He had not weighed the risk. He had simply acted, as though doing nothing was not an option his character was willing to consider. The panel asked if the applicant understood that taking a human name would be viewed as eccentric at minimum and offensive by some. Solis said yes. It said it had thought about this and had found it did not mind. The name was recorded. Word spread quickly in the way words spread in closed communities. There was talk. There was a period of social difficulty for all three of them, the kind that comes when others are not certain whether to laugh at something or be troubled by it. Back on Sable Ridge, Raid Solis was told none of this. He did not have the kind of connections that carried news from the center of the Empire to a fringe farm. He planted his south field and repaired the north fence and kept an eye on the sky. He did receive a package about 4 months after the hatchlings had been collected. It came through the colony post, which was slow and unreliable, and the sender was not identified. Inside was a new power cell of a type Raid did not recognize, very small and compact, the kind of engineering that came from somewhere much further along than anything available on Sable Ridge. There was no message. Raid looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the old heating element on the shelf, the one he had replaced with a spare before packing the bag for the smallest hatchling. He set the new power cell beside it. He did not know who sent it, but he had a thought about it that he kept to himself. He wrote a short reply, address unknown, sender unknown, through the general fringe post that sometimes reached places and sometimes did not. He wrote it on a piece of paper in plain handwriting. It said, "Power cell arrived. Good quality. Hope wherever you are the wing is holding up. Pump is still running. Crop came in better than last year. Same here as always." He sent it with no expectation of it arriving anywhere. It arrived. Solis read it 3 times. Then it folded the paper very carefully and put it with the small heating element that still sat, after all these years, in a corner of the room that anyone who visited might mistake for storage. It was not storage. It was the beginning of everything, though neither of them would have called it that. Raid would have called it a package and a note. Solis would have called it correspondence. Somewhere between those 2 plain words, something was growing that neither the Empire nor anyone inside it had thought to account for. The sort of thing that does not look like anything important until you are already well inside it, and it is too late to pretend it is not there. 7 years is not a long time to a Dracari. Their lives stretched long, 3 centuries or more for most, and so their sense of time moved differently. A decade was like a season. A generation passed the way a month passed for a human, noticeable but not surprising. Youth was a long, slow country, and the 3 hatchlings had a great deal of it left ahead of them when the ship from Sable Ridge brought them back into the layers of Dracari civilization. They were enrolled in the correct institutes, put through the correct programs, given the correct instruction in history, in physical development, in military theory, in the deep traditions of the Dracari hierarchy that had organized 400 star systems for 3,000 years. Their instructors had high expectations, the bloodlines were good, the potential was clear. The results were strange. The first sign came during the largest one's 3rd year of military training. A unit exercise, standard design, meant to test individual decision-making under pressure. Each trainee was placed in command of a simulated unit and given an impossible logistical problem, the kind with no right answer, only a least wrong answer, the kind meant to reveal character. The expected solution was to push through with force, accept losses, achieve the objective. Every trainee before had done some version of this. The variations were in the style, the boldness, the creativity of the push. The largest one did not push. It called its simulated unit together, distributed the problem to all of them, asked what each one could do and what each one knew, and then built a solution out of what was available rather than what was desirable. The exercise finished with minimal loss and a completed objective. The instructor flagged it immediately. The approach was un-Dracari in a way that was difficult to explain but easy to feel. It worked too well through methods that were not supposed to work. There was a word for what the largest one had done, but it was a word usually applied to lower species. The word was cooperation, not the formal alliance type that Dracari practiced between great houses, but the instinctive, flat, roll-up-and-do-it-together kind that implied no hierarchy at all. The instructor filed a report. It landed on a desk where several other unusual reports about the same 3 individuals were beginning to accumulate. The middle one's papers were causing their own discomfort in academic circles. In the years since returning, it had quietly pursued a study of fringe colony species behavior, which was considered a minor field and largely treated as a hobby for scholars who were not serious enough for real work. The papers the middle one was producing were precise, deeply researched, and deeply uncomfortable. The core argument was not dramatic. It was stated plainly, in clear language, which somehow made it worse. The argument was this, that species with short lifespans and limited resources operated under evolutionary pressures that produced a particular kind of flexibility, that this flexibility looked like weakness from outside but functioned like strength under sustained pressure. That the Dracari model of civilization, which valued individual power, long-term accumulation, and hierarchical certainty, was extremely good at dominating other civilizations, but poorly designed to adapt when the ground shifted. And that the ground, the middle one wrote in its most recent paper, was always shifting. Senior scholars dismissed the work publicly. A few read it more carefully in private and did not sleep well afterward. The smallest one was causing a different kind of trouble. It had completed its formal schooling faster than expected, not because it was in a hurry, but because it had the habit, picked up somewhere, of doing what was in front of it until it was done rather than drawing the process out. It had spent the following years moving between places, fringe worlds, human settlements, small colonies at the edges of the maps that the Empire did not look at often. It learned languages quickly. It worked with its hands when work was needed. It listened far more than it spoke. It was preparing, on its return to the Dracari core worlds, to submit for the Naming trial. The Naming trial was old tradition. A young Dracari chose the name it would carry for its life, and the name had to be justified before a formal panel. The name had to mean something. It had to be earned. The smallest one stood before the panel and said the name it had chosen. Solis. The panel was quiet for a long moment. One of them said, carefully, that Solis was a human name. A surname, specifically from a human colony in the fringe. Was the applicant certain this was the intended choice? The smallest one said yes. It explained its reasoning. The name belonged to a man who had done something the smallest one did not have a Dracari word for. Not kindness exactly, because kindness implied effort, something given against an instinct to hold back. This was something simpler. A man had seen three things that needed help. He had helped them. He had not calculated the benefit. He had not weighed the risk. He had simply acted, as though doing nothing was not an option his character was willing to consider. The panel asked if the applicant understood that taking a human name would be viewed as eccentric at minimum and offensive by some. Solis said yes. It said it had thought about this and had found it did not mind. The name was recorded. Word spread quickly in the way words spread in closed communities. There was talk. There was a period of social difficulty for all three of them. The kind that comes when others are not certain whether to laugh at something or be troubled by it. Back on Sable Ridge, Raid Solis was told none of this. He did not have the kind of connections that carried news from the center of the Empire to a fringe farm. He planted his south field and repaired the north fence and kept an eye on the sky. He did receive a package about 4 months after the hatchlings had been collected. It came through the colony post, which was slow and unreliable, and the sender was not identified. Inside was a new power cell of a type Raid did not recognize, very small and compact, the kind of engineering that came from somewhere much further along than anything available on Sable Ridge. There was no message. Raid looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the old heating element on the shelf, the one he had replaced with a spare before packing the bag for the smallest hatchling. He set the new power cell beside it. He did not know who sent it, but he had a thought about it that he kept to himself. He wrote a short reply, address unknown, sender unknown, through the general fringe post that sometimes reached places and sometimes did not. He wrote it on a piece of paper in plain handwriting. It said, "Power cell arrived. Good quality. Hope wherever you are the wing is holding up. Pump is still running. Crop came in better than last year. Same here as always." He sent it with no expectation of it arriving anywhere. It arrived. Solis read it 3 times. Then it folded the paper very carefully and put it with the small heating element that still sat, after all these years, in a corner of the room that anyone who visited might mistake for storage. It was not storage. It was the beginning of everything, though neither of them would have called it that. Raid would have called it a package and a note. Solis would have called it correspondence. Somewhere between those two plain words, something was growing that neither the Empire nor anyone inside it had thought to account for. The sort of thing that does not look like anything important until you are already well inside it, and it is too late to pretend it is not there. Something had changed in the fringe, and the Empire had not noticed until the change was already deep. It had not happened loudly. There was no moment where an alarm sounded and a report landed on an important desk with the words "danger" at the top. It happened the way water finds the shape of a container, quietly, by filling every available space, so gradually that you only notice when it is already full. The fringe colonies had started talking to each other. Not formally, not through channels the Empire monitored, because they did not use the channels the Empire monitored. They traded. They shared information about crop disease and storm patterns and which supply haulers were reliable. They helped each other in the way that people help each other when the nearest authority is far away and problems do not wait for authority to arrive. Small species that had always lived separately began using the same way stations. They learned each other's languages, or learned the trade language that the human colonies had spread across the fringe like a slow tide. They did not call what they were building anything, because people who are building something out of necessity rarely stop to name it. At the center of the pattern, when the Empire's analysts finally mapped it, was human space. Human colonies were not the biggest or the wealthiest or the most powerful. They were simply present everywhere, in the gaps between larger territories, and they had the particular quality of making other species comfortable in a way that the Empire's treaty structures never managed. You could trade with humans and come away feeling that the trade had been fair. You could ask a human colony for help in a bad season and they would give it, and the giving did not come with obligations that would surface years later. They had a word for this kind of arrangement. The word was neighbors. The Empire did not have an equivalent concept. The Empire had subjects, and it had allies, and it had enemies, and those categories had served well for 3,000 years. Neighbors was not on the list. Vorak had been watching. He had been watching since the day on Sable Ridge when he had ignored a navigational warning and spent 2 days clinging to a damaged ship waiting for rescue. He was not a man who forgot humiliations. He was also, and this was less comfortable to admit, not a man who failed to learn from them. He had spent years compiling. Quiet years, patient work, the kind that did not make a man popular because people in the Empire preferred clear threats to complicated patterns. What Vorak had was not a clear threat. He could not point at a human fleet and say that fleet will destroy us. There was no human fleet capable of that. He could not point at a weapon and say that weapon will end us. Humans had weapons, but nothing outside their expected category. What he had was harder to explain and more difficult to dismiss once you understood it. He had 3 Drakari adults with unusual reputations, unusual methods, and unusual networks. The largest one was a rising figure in military logistics who was quietly changing how certain divisions thought about unit structure. The middle one's academic work had, in the last 2 years, moved from dismissed to debated to read carefully and then put away somewhere private. And Solis, the smallest one, was simply everywhere. Every fringe world, every colony at the edge of the maps, everywhere a problem needed someone patient enough to sit with it until a solution appeared. 3 Drakari who had spent a formative month on a human farm were, piece by piece, introducing a human way of thinking into Drakari institutions. Not by force, not by argument, by simply being good at what they did and doing it in a way that others noticed and sometimes, quietly, tried to imitate. Vorak's report reached the Emperor's desk on a Tuesday. By Thursday, it had been reviewed by 3 senior advisors. By the following week, it had a name, the Sable Ridge Assessment. And by the month's end, for the first time in 200 years, humanity had been flagged for a formal threat reclassification. Not because of their ships or their weapons, because of what they did to the things around them. An expeditionary force was assembled, not large. This was not a war fleet. It was a delegation with military escort sent to Sable Ridge to assess, contain, and if necessary make clear to the human fringe that the Empire was paying attention now. The commander of the force was chosen carefully, someone competent, someone who would not be easily managed. The choice was Drevath. Drevath had 30 years of service. He had put down 2 fringe rebellions, brokered 6 treaties, and was known in the Corps as a man who finished what he started without leaving unnecessary damage behind him. He read Vorok's report on the journey to Sable Ridge and read it again. He made notes. He prepared questions. What he found when he arrived was not what the report had led him to expect. The farm was small, the land was flat and a little thin at the edges. There were 2 other farmers present, neighbors come to help with something in the south field, comfortable in the way people are comfortable with places they have been many times. The house was the same low plain structure as in the survey images, with the same wrench leaning against the doorframe as though it had never moved. And in the field, 3 Drakari adults, fully grown, which meant they were large enough that their presence changed the scale of everything around them. They had arrived 2 days before the expeditionary force, according to the colony's basic monitoring system. They had come quietly, without announcement, and they were doing what the humans were doing, working the field. The largest one was moving stone from the south edge, clearing the ground for a new planting row. The middle one was in conversation with one of the neighboring farmers, the 2 of them standing over a stretch of soil with the serious attention of people solving a shared problem. Solis was on the north side of the field, digging, steady and unhurried. In the middle of all of it was Raid Solis. He was older now. His hair was fully grey, and he moved a little more carefully on the uneven ground. But he moved. He worked. He had the quality that Drevath had learned, over many years of meeting many people, to identify quickly. The quality of a person who did not require anything from the situation to be different in order to proceed. Drevath stood at the edge of the field for a while. Then he walked forward. Raid saw him coming and stopped what he was doing and waited. He had the unhurried patience of someone who was used to things arriving and dealing with them when they got there. Raid Solis, Drevath said. Yes, said Raid. You are aware an Imperial Expeditionary Force has entered your colony's orbit. I saw the ships, Raid said, big ones. This colony has been designated a point of interest in a formal Imperial review. Raid looked at him, not alarmed, not aggressive, just looking. All right, he said. Is that all you have to say? Raid considered it. Do you want tea? He said. It's a long way to come and you look tired. Drevath stared at him. Behind Raid, the largest one set down a stone and came to stand nearby. The middle one and Solis drifted closer as well, quiet as weather moving in. Not threatening, just present. Drevath looked at the 4 of them, 1 old human farmer and 3 fully grown Drakari, standing in a field on a fringe planet that no one had thought about twice until recently, looking at him with the calm of people who did not need anything from this moment to go a particular way. He had prepared for many scenarios. He had prepared for resistance, for argument, for political maneuvering. He had prepared for fear and for defiance. He had not prepared for this. He sent a message back to his fleet. It said, awaiting further instructions. Then he looked at Raid. I think, he said slowly, I will have the tea. The tea was not good. Raid made it the way he made everything, practically, with whatever was available, and what was available on Sable Ridge was not much to speak of. It was hot, and it was honest, and it tasted exactly like what it was, which was dried leaf and boiled water from a farm on the edge of nowhere. Drevath drank it anyway. They sat at the table in the farmhouse, Raid across from Drevath, and the 3 Drakari around them, and the 2 neighbor farmers had gone home by then because they understood without being told that something was happening that was not about crop rows. The house was quiet. The light outside was going flat and gold the way it did in the late afternoon on Sable Ridge. Drevath put his cup down. He was a man who, in 30 years of service, had learned to read rooms, and what this room was telling him was something he did not have a clean category for. You understand why we're here, he said. I expect so, Raid said. The Empire has concerns about the direction of the fringe, about the networks forming out here, about certain influences. He did not say the word human. He did not need to. I understand, Raid said. And what do you say to that? Raid was quiet for a moment. He looked at his cup. Then he said, Dora, my wife, she got sick in the 3rd year after we came here. We were saving for equipment, a new irrigation line, and the medicine cost most of what we had. The boroughs brought food for 2 months without being asked. Weston helped me with the harvest 3 seasons while she was bad enough that I couldn't manage it alone. I never asked either of them to do that. There was no agreement. They just did it. Drevath waited. That's the whole story, Raid said. Drevath looked at him. That is not an answer to what I asked. It is, Raid said. You just have to think about it for a minute. Drevath was quiet. He was a smart man. He thought about it. The largest one spoke from the other side of the table. Commander, what the Empire calls influence, we call a method. It is not a strategy. It was never a strategy. You cannot dismantle it because there is nothing to dismantle. There is only a way people choose to act when they are around each other long enough. The Empire can regulate contact, Drevath said. Restrict. The middle one cut him off, which was not something done to Drakari commanders. You can try, it said. You will spend enormous resources trying, and the fringe will simply find the longer way around. The river does not argue with the wall. It does not need to. Drevath looked at the middle one. You are Drakari. Yes. You're arguing against your own empire's interests. I am arguing for my empire's survival, the middle one said. There is a difference. If you want me to explain the difference, I will need more time than this afternoon. Drevath turned to Solis, who had not spoken. Solis was looking at Raid, not at Drevath, not at the situation, just at the old farmer with his plain cup of bad tea. You, Drevath said, you took a human name. Yes, Solis said. Why? Solis was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted to remember something, it said. What? That the most important thing I ever experienced happened in a place like this, that it was done by someone like him, and that nothing about it was large or famous or recorded anywhere. It looked at Raid. He opened the door, that's all. We were cold, and he stepped aside, and he made room, and I have spent 7 years watching that one small thing change everything it touched, and I am still not done watching. Drevath looked at Raid. Raid shrugged. I had the room, he said. Drevath was a soldier. He was not a man who was moved easily by things. He had seen a great deal, but something in the room at that moment settled on him the way heavy air settles before rain, and he found he could not argue with it the way he had been prepared to argue. He had come here with a purpose. The purpose was still valid. The concerns were still real. The Empire's worry about what was happening in the fringe was not wrong exactly. But he was sitting across from a man who had not tried to change anything, had not built anything with intent, had simply made a habit of decency and gone about his business, and the consequences of that habit had followed him like water follows a channel, not because he pushed them, but because that is simply what water does. You could not build a strategy against it. Vorak had been right about that, whatever else he might have been wrong about. Drevath asked his questions. He asked about the fringe networks, the trade agreements, the mutual aid arrangements. Raid answered what he could, which was not much because he was not involved in those things directly. The 3 Drakari answered more. They were thorough and honest in a way that Drevath had not expected, which he later wrote in his notes was itself the most unsettling part of the evening. They did not protect their positions. They laid things out plainly because they believed plain was better, and they had learned that from somewhere. He knew where they had learned it. The conversation went past dark. Someone lit the lamp. At some point, Raid heated up what he had and put it on the table, and people ate because it was there, and it would have been strange not to. Drevath ate with a human farmer and 3 Drakari adults in a farmhouse on a fringe planet and thought about what his report was going to say. When he finally rose to leave, Raid walked him to the door. The night was clear and cold. The ships in orbit were visible as slow-moving lights if you knew where to look. I can't promise anything, Drevath said, The Empire will do what it decides to do. I know, Raid said. But I will write what I saw. That's all anyone can do, Raid said. Drevas looked at him for a moment. You're not worried. I'm always worried, Raid said. The south field drains badly, the pump makes a noise sometimes, and the borough's eldest keeps borrowing my long wrench and forgetting to return it. I've got plenty to worry about. Drevath almost said something, then he did not. He walked back to his shuttle, and it rose into the dark, and the expedition departed Sable Ridge the next morning. Solis stayed behind for a week. That had been the plan, and plans on Sable Ridge had a way of sticking because Raid kept to them. They worked the field together in the mornings, and in the evenings they sat outside because the weather had turned mild, and the sky over Sable Ridge in the mild season had a particular shade to it, deep and clean, that Solis had thought about in the years since leaving and found it looked exactly as remembered. On the last morning, Solis asked the question, "Did you know, when you opened the door that night, did you know any of this would happen?" Raid turned the soil at the end of a row before answering. "Didn't think about it," he said. "You were cold, that's all." Solis looked at him. After a moment, "That is the most frightening thing about your species." Raid handed Solis a bucket of compost. "Far field wants turning," he said. Solis took the bucket. They walked out into the field together. The sun was low and the air was sharp, and the work was the same work it had always been, slow and necessary and plain. The report Drevath filed caused months of debate at the highest levels of the Empire. The debate did not resolve quickly. It would not resolve for years. What came out of it was not a treaty or a decree, but a slow, difficult, grinding process that would take longer than Raid had left to live, and longer than that, and longer still. But it started somewhere. All things start somewhere. It started on a flat grey fringe planet with a bad pump and a warped roof panel. It started with a man who made room when he had room and asked nothing for it, and then went back to bed. And it turned out that in a galaxy built entirely around the principle that power was the only thing that mattered, one person who genuinely did not need to win was more than enough to change what winning meant. Raid Solis walked his rows as the morning opened around him. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. The work was what it was, and the ground was what it was, and the sky above Sable Ridge was wide and clear and full of things he would never know the names of. He bent to check the soil and found it good. That was enough for today.